Are we alone? Oscar said. Or is there more out there? Ulessa thought about the 6 other civilizations the Torvak Collective had encountered. She thought about the 47 years of diplomatic relations they maintained with the Seraph. She thought about the collective's maps of explored space, which covered perhaps 4% of this single galaxy. You are not alone, she said. You are extraordinarily not alone. Oscar nodded once, slowly. Good, he said, and then, quieter almost to himself, good. That night, watching the planet turn below us, Voreth stood at the viewport for a long time. Portho found him there near the end of the 3rd watch, staring at the lights of their cities scattered across the dark side of the world like something spilled and sparkling. Sir, Portho said. Initial reports from command. They have read the preliminary assessment. And they are requesting we proceed with caution. They note that the human civilization is young, volatile, prone to internal conflict, and possesses technology that, while currently less advanced than ours in most categories, has been developing at a rate that several of the senior analysts found, and I am quoting directly here, alarming. Voreth nodded slowly. They are also requesting your personal assessment, Portho said. For the record, how dangerous do you believe them to be? Voreth was quiet for a moment. Down on the surface, in a listening station in a high desert, a woman named Maris was probably still working. Somewhere a man named Oscar was writing notes in his notebook. Somewhere a professor named Brecken was probably doing something wonderfully strange with all the information she had collected. They are not dangerous, Voreth said, in the way command means. Sir, they are not dangerous because they want to destroy things, he said. They are capable of destruction, enormously so. Their history makes that very plain. He paused. But they sent us a pop song, then they prepared a notebook. Then they asked if we objected to their weather satellites because farmers needed them. He turned from the window. They are dangerous the way a fire is dangerous, not because it wants to burn you, but because it does not know how to be small. Portho considered this. What do we do with that? He asked. Voreth looked back at the lights. We make sure, he said, that we are standing close enough to warm ourselves and far enough away not to get burned. He paused one final time, and we pay very close attention, because I have been watching civilizations for 400 years, Portho, and I have never once seen anything accelerate like that. He gestured at the window, at the lights, at the small, loud, temporary, extraordinary creatures making them. Whatever they become next, he said, I want to be there when it happens. Portho looked at the planet. Then, despite himself, he nodded. Because in 13 seconds a woman named Maris had decided the universe was worth calling her supervisor about. In 11 days a man named Oscar had represented an entire planet with a notebook and a question. And in the dark of space for the first time in 400 years Commander Voreth, who had seen everything, was genuinely, helplessly unable to predict what came next. He was, if he was honest, looking forward to it. The day we met humans, our High Commander Voreth lost 3 of his 9 ceremonial head frills from sheer shock. He regrew them later, obviously. But the dignity? That never came back. Let me set the scene properly. Our fleet, the galactic sovereignty of the Torvak Collective, had been sailing through the outer arm of the Milky Way for roughly 400 years. Standard scouting run, nothing exciting. Lots of empty rocks, a few gas giants with storms large enough to swallow a cruiser whole, the occasional asteroid belt that tried to murder our navigators, the usual Tuesday. We had charts, we had data. We had 17 layers of pre-scan protocols designed to detect intelligent life before we stumbled into it like some kind of intergalactic fool tripping over his own tail. None of that helped. Because when the long-range sensors finally pinged a signal from a small blue-green world in a rather ordinary solar system, the signal it pinged back was, and I am quoting the official transcript here, a pop song, not a greeting, not a mathematical sequence designed to communicate peaceful intent. Not a structured radio broadcast using prime numbers, a pop song about dancing. Senior Scanner Officer Delira stared at her console for 11 full seconds. She later told the inquiry board that she spent those 11 seconds genuinely reconsidering every life choice that had led her to this moment. Then she called Commander Voreth. Sir, she said very carefully in the tone of someone about to deliver news they personally did not want to be responsible for, I believe we have found life. Excellent, said Voreth, who was in the middle of his morning meditation and clearly had not been listening. What kind? The kind, Delira said, that is currently broadcasting something called, and I am translating loosely here, Baby Shark across 47 different frequencies simultaneously. There was a silence, a very long silence. Then Voreth came to the bridge. Our first formal assessment of Earth, compiled over the next 6 rotations of their moon, was complicated. The beings called themselves humans. They walked on 2 legs, they had hair in alarming places and no natural armor of any kind. Their maximum lifespan, we calculated, was roughly 100 of their solar years, which made them, compared to us, almost heartbreakingly temporary. The average Torvak lives 800 years. The eldest members of our High Council are approaching 3,000. By any reasonable standard, humans should have been children. By every measurable standard, they acted like it. They argued constantly. About everything. About borders drawn in sand on a planet they had only recently figured out was round. About which of their thousands of sports teams was the superior sports team. About the correct temperature at which to serve certain beverages. I want to be very clear. They had dedicated serious broadcast time and entire online platforms accessible to all members of their civilization, specifically to the correct serving temperature of beverages. And yet they had also, in the span of roughly 200 years, gone from burning wood for heat to splitting atoms for power. From sails made of woven plant material to ships that left their atmosphere entirely. From communicating by hitting drums and patterns to carrying pocket-sized devices that connected every human on the planet to every other human on the planet instantaneously. 200 years. We had taken 4,000. Our chief xenobiologist, a cautious and methodical scholar named Prentice, filed a report so dry it nearly made my secondary eyelids close permanently. But buried in page 47 in a footnote so small it almost looked accidental, he wrote, "Note on temporal development velocity. Human civilization has accelerated through developmental phases at a rate that our current models cannot adequately explain. Recommend extended observation before formal first contact." Extended observation turned out to be 6 more months. Then something happened that forced our hand. One of their spacecraft, an unmanned probe they had launched into the outer solar system decades earlier, drifted a little too close to our rear observation vessel, not close enough to cause damage, but close enough that our passive cloaking fields interacted with their probe's instruments in a way that produced readings they were definitely not expecting. We know this because, 43 hours later, one of their news broadcasts spent a full segment discussing an anomalous gravitational signature near one of their outer planets. Then a second broadcast speculated it might be a cloaked spacecraft. Then a third broadcast, and I want to stress that only 43 hours had passed, ran a segment titled, with what I can only describe as extraordinary confidence, "We are definitely not alone. Here is what to do if they land." The segment included a step-by-step guide. Step 1 was, apparently, stay calm. The irony of this advice coming from the species that had just broadcast a pop song about a baby shark into deep space was apparently lost on them. Vorith called an emergency council session. The debate lasted 4 days. Arguments were made for retreating entirely. Arguments were made for waiting longer. Arguments were made for immediate contact. Senior diplomat Ulessa, who had negotiated treaties with 6 separate spacefaring civilizations, argued for a slow and careful approach built on graduated communication, beginning with mathematical sequences and moving incrementally toward linguistic exchange over the course of several years. She was very persuasive. She had credentials going back 2 centuries. She had a prepared presentation with diagrams. Then Ensign Portho, the youngest member of the communication team, quietly pointed out that the humans had already set up an online forum specifically dedicated to decoding what they believed to be an alien communication signal, and they had, in the 72 hours since their news broadcast, already developed 3 competing theories, a proposed mathematical framework for response, and a meme about the whole situation that was circulating among roughly 400 million of their people. "They are," Portho said, in a voice carefully stripped of all visible emotion, "already waiting for us to say hello." Ulessa looked at her diagrams for a long moment. "How long?" she asked slowly. "Have they been doing this? The forum?" "About 3 days. But their general preparation for first contact? Their literature, their scientific speculation, their cultural preparation for encountering alien life?" Portho pulled up a data window. "Approximately 150 years." Ulessa closed her diagrams. "Make the call," she said. So we made the call. The first human to receive our transmission was a junior researcher at a listening station in the high desert of a continent they called North America. Her name, our translators eventually rendered, was something like Maris. She had been on the overnight shift, running routine calibrations, drinking something they called coffee, which from what we could tell was a hot bitter liquid they consumed in enormous quantities apparently to remain conscious during the hours their biology usually demanded sleep. She received our signal at approximately 3 in the morning, local time. She sat very still for 13 seconds. Then she picked up her communication device and called her supervisor. "Hey," she said. "Yeah, sorry to wake you. No, I know what time it is." A pause. "I need you to come in." Another pause. "Because there's something on the signal that She stopped. "I think we need to loop in the director, and probably the government, and maybe like everyone." Her supervisor asked if she was all right. "I'm fine," said Maris. I think they said hello. And I think they're waiting." 13 seconds. That was all the time she took. 13 seconds between receiving a transmission from a civilization she had never met, from a species she had never seen, in a language that should have been completely incomprehensible, and deciding with confidence to act. Our fastest military response officer in a first contact scenario takes, on average, 4 minutes to act, after extensive training, after simulations, after years of psychological preparation. Maris had been awake for 6 hours running calibrations and drinking bitter liquid, and she moved in 13 seconds. Voreth watched the recording of her phone call 4 times. Then he sat in his chair and said absolutely nothing for a very long time. "They're not afraid," he said finally. Science Officer Delune, who had been monitoring the recording alongside him, tilted her head. "To be precise, sir, she appears to be somewhat afraid. Her vocal stress indicators suggest elevated anxiety. Her hands are shaking visibly in the recording. But she acted anyway," Voreth said. "Yes," Delune said. "Immediately." Voreth was quiet for another moment. "Pull me the rest of the file," he said. "Everything, their military history, all of it." Delune hesitated. She had read the military history file. She had in fact read it twice, and then gone for a very long walk through the observation deck staring at stars until she felt better. "Sir," she said carefully, "I should mention, their military history is extensive. I assumed. It is also, in places rather, and I want to choose the right word here, rather vivid." Voreth looked at her. "Pull the file," he said. Delune pulled the file. Voreth read it. He started at the beginning, which was a long time ago by human reckoning, but practically yesterday by ours. He read about armies and sieges, about navies crossing oceans, about wars fought with spears and wars fought with bullets and wars fought with fire from the sky. He read about alliances formed and broken and formed again. He read about humans who fought for decades, who rebuilt civilizations from rubble, who developed weapons of absolute devastation and then, remarkably, chose not to keep using them, though not without significant debate. He was reading for a very long time before he stopped. "Delune," he said. "Sir, the youngest human soldier on record, the one in this file from approximately 80 rotations ago, the one they call a child soldier. How old was that individual?" Delune checked. 13 years by their reckoning. A child. By our developmental scale, that would make them, biologically, roughly equivalent to a Torvak at first primary schooling. Voreth set down the file. "And how old is the youngest active member of their current standing military?" 17 years. In most nations, some allow 18 only. Some still lower in certain circumstances. "And how old," Voreth said very slowly, "is the Torvak Collective's youngest active enlisted soldier?" Delune did not need to check this one. She knew it. Everyone knew it. 80 years, sir. First enlistment eligibility begins at 80 years of age. Before that, candidates are in preparatory training. Voreth nodded once, very slowly. "Do you understand what I am looking at, Delune?" "I think so, sir." "The youngest human soldier on record," he said, "was older than their entire civilization when we first encountered our own spacefaring neighbors." He paused. "Their civilization is roughly 6,000 years old, in a meaningful sense, and they were sending children to war before that." "Yes, sir." "Not metaphorical children, actual ones." "Yes, sir." Voreth stood up. He walked to the viewport. He looked at the small blue-green planet turning slowly in the dark, bright and unremarkable and full of creatures that slept only 8 hours a night and somehow still managed to build everything, fight everything, survive everything, and then turn around and send a pop song about a baby shark into the cosmos with apparent sincerity. "Contact High Command," he said. "To report the discovery?" "To request the full diplomatic package," he said, "and the military assessment team, and the cultural integration specialists." He paused. "And tell them to send whoever handles, I do not know the official term, psychological preparation for dealing with something entirely unprecedented." Delune was already reaching for her console. "And Delune, sir?" "Tell them," Voreth said, still looking at the planet, "to take it seriously. Tell them not to underestimate them because they are small, or young, or temporary." He turned from the viewport, and the look on his face was one that I, personally, had never seen on the face of a Torvak commander in 40 years of service. Tell them that these are exactly the kind of creatures that small and young and temporary produce when they are also apparently completely unafraid of anything. Delun sent the message. High Command received it 47 minutes later. They called for an emergency session within the hour. It was the fastest emergency session in the history of the collective. Vorith, for his part, went back to the file. He read all night. And in the morning, when first light was catching the edge of that little blue-green world and Maris, down on the surface, was probably still sitting in her listening station waiting with whatever patience she had left, he said to no one in particular, "All right then, let us see what they do next." He did not yet know what they would do next, but he was already, against all his training and better judgment, rather looking forward to it. The diplomatic team arrived 3 weeks later. I say arrived generously. What they actually did was spend 2 weeks arguing about the correct formation for an approach vector, then 4 days arguing about what to wear, and then finally descended toward Earth's orbit in a formation that senior diplomat Ulessa described as measured and authoritative, and that Ensign Portho, under his breath, described as 15 ships trying to look casual. By the time we reached low orbit, the humans had already identified all 15 vessels on their tracking systems, named each one, and started a live broadcast covering our arrival with what appeared to be enthusiastic commentary, background music, and sponsored advertising breaks. I want to repeat that last part. Sponsored advertising breaks. Our arrival, the single most significant event in the recorded history of their civilization, the moment they had speculated about and written stories about and made films about for over a century, was being interrupted every 12 minutes by commercials for car insurance. Ulessa watched the broadcast feed with the expression of someone who had prepared for this moment for 30 years and was now discovering that nothing, not a single simulation, not one training program, not any amount of psychological preparation had adequately covered this specific scenario. "They are," she said, very quietly, "monetizing first contact." "Apparently," said Portho, who by this point had simply accepted everything. "In real time." "Yes, ma'am." Ulessa straightened her formal robes. She had 7 layers of diplomatic credentials. She had negotiated the Velthan peace accords. She had once talked a militarized insectoid empire out of a preemptive strike using nothing but a very convincing slideshow and an argument about long-term economic benefit. "Open the channel," she said. The human they put on was named Oscar. He was a mid-level official from something called the United Nations, which, when we looked it up, turned out to be an organization composed of every nation on Earth designed to facilitate communication and cooperation between them. We thought this was very sensible. Then we read the footnotes and discovered it had been founded immediately after a war so catastrophic it had killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people in under 6 years, because the humans had felt, at that point, that perhaps some kind of organizational structure for talking to each other before starting things was advisable. The war had involved weapons capable of flattening entire cities in seconds. The humans had used them, twice. Then they had stopped, reconsidered, built the United Nations, and moved on. Oscar, to his enormous credit, appeared on our channel looking calm, professional, and entirely prepared. He was wearing what they called a suit, which was a garment that communicated authority through the medium of small decorative knots tied around the throat for reasons that, even after extensive research, our cultural team could not fully explain. "Good morning," he said. "Or good whatever time it is for you. I'm Oscar Mendel, representing the United Nations First Contact Committee. On behalf of Earth, welcome." Ulessa blinked exactly once. She had prepared a greeting. It was 3 paragraphs long. It referenced our civilization's founding principles, our commitment to peaceful exploration, and our hope for a relationship of mutual benefit and understanding. She had rehearsed it. She had timed it. She had not prepared for the fact that the human would simply start talking first, in a perfectly normal voice, as if this was a meeting that had been scheduled in advance and he was simply arriving on time. "Thank you," Ulessa said, slightly off her prepared script. "We have some questions," Oscar said pleasantly. "As do we," Ulessa said, recovering. "Perhaps we should begin by—" "Great," said Oscar, and pulled out what appeared to be a small notebook. "So first, are you here with hostile intent? Yes or no is fine." The diplomatic team stared at their screens. Ulessa said, "No." "Fantastic," said Oscar, making a small note. "Second, are there more of you coming?" "There are more of our species, yes, but this fleet represents—" "That's fine," Oscar said, still writing. "Third, and I want to stress this is just for our own planning purposes, do you have any objection to us continuing to operate our satellite systems during these talks? We have a lot of satellites." "We are aware of the satellites," Ulessa said. "Some of them are important for weather forecasting," Oscar added. "Farmers depend on them." Ulessa looked at Portho. Portho looked carefully at his console. We have no objection to your satellites, Ulessa said. Brilliant, said Oscar, making another note. Right. Now what can we do for you? That was the moment I think that Ulessa realized she was dealing with something genuinely different from every civilization she had previously encountered. Not because Oscar was intimidating, not because he was aggressive or defensive or suspicious, because he was, against all odds and all reason, prepared. Not in the way we were prepared, not in the way any spacefaring civilization we had ever encountered was prepared, with layered defensive protocols and centuries of cultural fortification and carefully modulated fear. He was prepared in the way a person is prepared when they have spent a very long time thinking about how something might go and have decided, eventually, that whatever happens they can handle it. He had a notebook. He had questions in the notebook. He had clearly written those questions down in advance. The humans had prepared for first contact the way they prepared for every other event in their extraordinary, chaotic, slightly unhinged history. They had argued about it for decades. They had written thousands of conflicting papers. They had made films, some of which ended very badly for everyone involved and some of which ended in friendship and several of which ended with humans punching aliens in the face, which our cultural team had flagged as a concern that Portho assured them was probably fictional in intent. And then when the moment actually came, they had put a man in a suit with a notebook and sent him to be politely professional about the whole thing. Ulissa gathered herself. We would like to propose formal diplomatic relations, she said, an exchange of cultural and scientific information, a framework for ongoing communication, an agreement on territorial boundaries within this solar system. Oscar nodded. We'd like that too. We do want to flag that we have a few ongoing disputes about some of those territorial boundaries amongst ourselves, so that might get complicated. Amongst yourselves? Ulessa said. We haven't fully sorted out who owns some of the outer planets yet, Oscar said in the tone of a man explaining a minor inconvenience. We only recently started sending people up there, but we can work around that. Our chief legal officer, a meticulous individual named Herrick who had spent 200 years specializing in interstellar territorial law, sent a message through the internal channel that simply read, "They have not decided who owns their own solar system yet?" Portho sent back, "Apparently not." Herrick sent, "But they have sent probes to all of it." Portho sent, "Yes." Herrick sent, "They claimed it and then did not finish the paperwork." Portho sent, "Herrick, I am going to need you to simply accept that this is a recurring theme." The formal talks began 2 days later on a neutral platform, which took those 2 days to agree on because the humans, upon learning we had a diplomatic vessel with a large conference room, immediately began internally debating whether agreeing to hold talks on our ship constituted some kind of symbolic concession that might set a bad precedent, a debate which, to their credit, they resolved very quickly by simply asking us whether the ship had good coffee facilities, and when Portho confirmed that we could provide any beverage they required, they said that was fine then. The delegation that came aboard was 8 people. We had expected diplomats. We had expected officials. We had expected carefully selected representatives embodying the best of human civilization, chosen for their calm, their wisdom, their diplomatic experience. We got 7 diplomats and 1 individual named Brecken who turned out to be a xenolinguistics professor from a university in a country called Finland who had apparently been included because she had published a paper 12 years earlier that their committee considered foundational to their communication protocols, and who arrived on our ship, looked around the conference room and immediately began taking detailed notes on the architecture with the focused intensity of a person who had just discovered they were living inside their own life's work. Brecken was the most interesting human I met in the entire first contact period. But that is a story for a different time. The talks proceeded. They were slow. They were detailed. They were, at certain points, genuinely productive and even moving, those moments when 2 civilizations that had developed in total isolation from one another discovered, with something like wonder, that they had arrived at certain ideas independently, that some things, mathematics and certain principles of physics and the understanding that the universe is very large and full of things worth knowing translated cleanly across the gap between species. But then, day 4. Herrick was presenting the draft framework for scientific information exchange. He was on slide 9 of 43. He was being very thorough, because Herrick was always thorough, and he was explaining the standard Torvac protocols for classifying research findings according to their potential dual-use applications, meaning scientific information that could serve peaceful purposes but could also theoretically be applied to weapons development. Oscar listened politely. Then he said, "How do you classify information that was originally developed for weapons and then repurposed for peaceful use?" Herrick blinked. I'm sorry? Like, if something was invented specifically as a weapons technology and then later became useful for medicine or infrastructure, where does that go in your classification system? There was a pause. Herrick said, carefully, that is not a common enough occurrence in our research history to warrant its own classification category. Oscar looked genuinely puzzled. Really? Weapons technology and peaceful research technology are typically developed in separate tracks, Herrick said, for ethical reasons. Oscar looked at the rest of his delegation. Brecken had stopped taking notes on the architecture and was now looking up with the particular expression of a person watching something about to become very interesting. We would need a very large category for that, said one of the other human delegates, a tall woman named Solange whose official title was something like Deputy Secretary of Science and Technology. Quite a lot of our foundational technologies came out of military research programs. How much? Herrick said, in the tone of someone who already suspected he did not want to know the answer. Is quite a lot. The Internet, Solange said, which our translators rendered as a global communications network, came from a military project. GPS navigation came from military satellite programs. Most of our advances in rocketry, material science, miniaturized computing, several branches of medicine, nuclear power, the microwave oven. I'm sorry, said Herrick. The what? The microwave oven, Solange said. It's a cooking device. It was discovered by accident during radar research. Herrick looked at his notes. Then he looked at Ulessa. Then he looked back at his notes. You, he said slowly, invented a cooking device by accident while developing military targeting technology. That's correct, Solange said pleasantly. And then you kept using it. It heats food very quickly, Solange said. Herrick sat in silence for a moment that stretched beyond ordinary silence into a kind of territory that can only be described as philosophical. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, we are going to need a new category. The talks concluded. At their preliminary phase after 11 days, no comprehensive agreement had been reached because 11 days is a very short time to negotiate between civilizations, but a framework had been established and both sides had agreed to a follow-up summit and an ongoing communication channel and an information exchange program that would take several years to properly design. At the final session, Oscar produced something from his bag and placed it on the table. It was a small object, flat, rectangular, about the size of one of their hands. A gift, he said, for your archives. It is a complete copy of our history. Everything we have written down, all of it. Ulessa looked at the object. Everything? She said. Everything we could fit on there, he said. Which is most of it. It is a lot. We are grateful, Ulessa said. We will provide you with a comparable archive of Torvak history. Oscar smiled. It was the expression their faces made when they were pleased. A pulling back of the corners of the mouth, a showing of teeth that meant, counterintuitively, that they were friendly rather than threatening. It had taken our team several days to stop reacting to it with alarm. One more thing, Oscar said. Yes? Our people, he said, on the ground. They have a lot of questions, and I mean a truly extraordinary number of questions. We are prepared for the fact that you may not be ready to answer most of them yet. That is fine. But they want to know one thing. One thing above all the others. Ulessa waited.